And in fact, what took place after his meeting with some of the brethren in Jerusalem, including Peter, or excuse me, including James, his half brother, Jesus' half brother. Excuse me, I'll get my head right in a second. As he was expecting, of course, he was taken over by a mob. That's just the only way to put it. It was a mob mentality. You know, all it takes, and for those of you that saw the events of yesterday at President Trump's rally, it's very easy for things to become very chaotic when one person. I see some. Is anybody not aware of what took place yesterday in Pennsylvania? Okay. It's very easy that when one person starts turmoil in a group and they've got like mind in terms of their bias or their prejudice against an individual, to join in, and before you know it, things are out of control. And of course, that's what happens to Paul in Jerusalem. And even though he was expecting it, no doubt, it was a particular time in his life that while he was expecting it, nevertheless was something that was very difficult to endure. To the point where, of course, he was beaten, and he was other things were done to him, bound to a Roman centurion 24/7. And when we left him, he was about to entertain speaking to this mob. And what we're going to find very interesting, and what he shares is his conversion. And we want to make some observations about why he shared his conversion. What was the purpose of what he did, what he said. His conversion, of course, we were introduced to back in Acts the 9th chapter. But there's some things at the end of the 22nd chapter, after he basically repeats what happened in the 9th chapter. There's a few additional, little more additional information that's not revealed in Acts the 9th chapter. And so as chapter 21 closes out, of course, the verse 36, the mob of the people followed, crying out, "Away with him." And then verse 27, as Paul was about to be brought into the barracks, the Roman guard there, he said to the tribune, may, pretty polite, isn't he? May I say something to you? And of course, the Roman official was curious. He said, well, do you know Greek? And he said, are you not the Egyptian then who recently stirred up a revolt and led the 4,000 men of the assassins out into the wilderness? Well, he was not. But that's what the centurion was afraid of, that he was confronting a very evil person here. But then in verse 29, Paul replied and told him who he was. I'm a Jew. I'm from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no obscure city. Remember that Tarsus was a very important city. It's about 12 miles off the coast. It would be in the southern part of modern-day Turkey, along the northern border of the Mediterranean Sea. Southern border of Turkey, northern border of the Mediterranean Sea, above Cyprus. It's a very important city to the Roman Empire. And so he was not from some city that they would not be aware of. And he says, I beg you, permit me to speak to the people. And there's verse 40 introduces chapter 22. And when he had been given permission, Paul, standing on the steps, motioned with his hand to the people. And when there was a great hush, he addressed them in the Hebrew language. And then he begins chapter 22, relating his conversion, relating some other things too that it was important that these people know. Okay? And the key to what he said in 22 is really revealed in verse 1 of 22. Brothers and fathers, hear the defense. Okay? That's one of the observations we need to make about chapter 22, is that what he's relating to them is not in any way, shape, or form a witnessing in the same sense of you're trying to convert somebody by sharing your conversion experience, but rather it's to defend himself and the actions that he has taken that they're after him about, okay? And why he has changed from what he previously did. Because those are important issues in regards to who Paul is now. We're not going to go in step by step of chapter 22 because most of us are familiar with Acts 9, and I will simply address those things that are not included in chapter 9. But he basically goes through on the road to Damascus, this bright light shined. He was taken into the city of Damascus where Ananias, the man Ananias, who had been told by the Lord what he was supposed to do. So he was met by Ananias, and he was told also, Paul was told what he needed to do. And Paul came to the understanding of what he needed to do to no longer be a persecutor of the Christians, that unless he changed his ways, he was going to be as destined for the same eventual condemnation as the rest of the Jews. But he was also responding to the fact that the Lord had told him what he had planned for him. Because it was on that road, it was at that time that Paul was told by the Lord, and that's repeated in Acts chapter 22, that he was to go into Damascus. He'd be told what to do, and then the Lord said, "I'm going to do some other things with you," and we'll talk about that in just a minute. So Paul repeats his conversion to them, and then part of what is I want to focus on. It's actually Acts 9, 15, and 16, but then also in chapter 22, verses 12 through 16. And that is this message from Ananias that was delivered to Paul. Because Ananias says that the God of our fathers has chosen you that you should do three things. You should know his will. You should hear the voice of his mouth. In other words, you're going to hear him speaking directly to you, which, of course, we know has already happened, but this is Ananias talking to Paul about it. And then important that you would also see the just one, he says. That is the single most important part of what Ananias said and what happened to Paul on the road to Damascus. Why? Why is that the most important part of his later apostleship? That's right. The apostles had to be eyewitnesses to the resurrected Christ. Okay? And so this is Paul, this is Ananias saying, well, this is what's going to qualify you to be God's minister in the way he wants you to be his minister. But it's also Paul also relating why he knows that he has an apostleship. And that he's the same, for lack of any other term, kind of witness as all the other apostles that have been ministering to the Jews and the Gentiles in this first century. And then, of course, Ananias, he repeats the fact that Ananias told him, what are you waiting for? Okay? You've gone through this very traumatic experience of having your vision taken away from you. Now, in Acts the 9th chapter, it reveals that things like scales fell from his eyes. Paul doesn't say that in that chapter 22. And I don't think that's a contradiction. I think it's just that in chapter 9, other people were saying what happened. So they saw the scales. Well, Paul's saying this vision was so light, I couldn't see anything. Okay? Now, why do you think that light was so bright? Why do you think that light was so bright? Not only was it traumatic, but what was Paul looking at this whole time? What did this great light represent? The Lord. Okay? Because remember, when he was seeing this bright light, he heard the voice. Okay? And so it was this light that he was seeing. So he was telling it from his perspective of after the light went away, and he was able to then see what was going on. And so then he of course was baptized. And I want us to now go to the 17th through the 21st verse of chapter 22, because in chapter 9 it leaves him at just he would receive food and he was strengthened. Not much more is said about the fact, other than he had to escape from Jerusalem. But I want us to look at chapter 22, verses 17 through 21, because Paul relates some additional information. He says in verse 17, "When I had returned to Jerusalem and was praying in the temple, I fell into a trance and saw him." Who's him? The Lord, obviously. "To me, make haste and set up out of Jerusalem quickly, because they will not accept your testimony about me." So this is additional information about the fact that he had to escape from Jerusalem. "And I said," Paul said, "and I said, Lord, they themselves know that in one synagogue after another I imprisoned and beat those who believed in you. And when the blood of Stephen, your witness, was being shed, I myself was standing by and approving and watching over the garments of those who killed him." This is Paul having a further discussion with the Lord about what's taken place in his life, his former life. And that's an important distinction to be made here. But then verse 21, the Lord responds to him, "Go, for I will send you away, I will send you far away to the Gentiles." This is the point at which Paul, I guess for lack of any other term, officially becomes known as the apostle to the Gentiles. Why was he to go to the Gentiles? Well, they needed him, but there were other apostles around that were going to the Gentiles. Why did the Lord say, "You go away to the Gentiles"? Well, the situation is, are the Jews ever going to listen to him? Of course not. He's a traitor. He's a traitor. They don't want to listen to him. All they want to do is kill him. In their minds, he's nothing but a low-down traitor. Even though Paul reminds them that he was doing it at the time based upon the commission that the leaders of the Jews gave to him. So he was, at that time he was doing what he was known, what he knew was the thing to do and what he was commissioned to do. But now is the fact that the Lord has commissioned him on an entirely different mission. And that is to take the gospel to the Gentiles. And so that's some additional vision in chapter 22 that's not included in Acts, the 9th chapter. And it's interesting that this came when Paul was doing what? He was praying. Where was he? He was in the temple, okay? So he was obviously in the presence of Jews, but the Lord spoke to him and said, "I'm taking you out of this place because you're not going to be able to survive in this place. They won't let you. They won't listen to you." Is that sort of like Jesus' teaching about when they won't listen to you? What are you supposed to do when you try to take the gospel to people? Take the dust off your feet and move on. If they won't listen, they won't listen. Okay? But he's going to do it in such a way that he understands that his real purpose, The Lord's real purpose for Paul was to take the gospel message to those that were outside of the Jewish faith. So it was at this point, obviously, that the mob, of course, at the end of chapter 22, which is not included in this lesson, but just some additional information. Um, up to this point, of course, they had been listening to Paul, I think there's some reasons why they were listening to Paul, which we'll talk about in just a second. But it becomes at this point where they're no longer listening to him, and it's obvious to Paul why the Lord told him what he told him. And so Paul will eventually go through some other situations while he's still in Jerusalem, but then eventually will, of course, leave Jerusalem. Any questions or comments, clarification? Okay, I want us to make some observations now about Paul's words here in chapter 22. I think one thing to note is, and I mentioned it earlier, verse 37, 21. How did he appeal to the commander? What was his manner? Politely, absolutely. He was polite to him. I mean, if you're really upset at somebody, or you're out of control in terms of your, where this needs to be, are you going to, here's a guy that, Paul has been imprisoned, he's been beaten, and even though this Roman official actually got him away from the mob to protect him in some sense, nevertheless, he's been under his control the whole time. And he knows that commander, or that whether he was a guard or he was actually probably the leader of the guard in Jerusalem, he knows that he has control over where he's going to go next and what he's going to be able to do. So he appeals to him and he says, "May I speak to the crowd?" Now, what is his language in the first verse of chapter 22 when he does begin addressing those that are there? How does he address them? Brethren, okay? He addresses them politely. He doesn't call you a bunch of scumbags, or you bunch of heathens or whatever. He speaks to them also in a respectful and polite manner. Now, what was Paul demonstrating at that time that's related to what he later taught about how we as Christians are supposed to appeal to others? What did Paul say, for instance, to the church at Colossae in chapter 4, verse 6? Let your speech always be what? Seasoned with salt, but more importantly, what was the first thing he said? Let it be gracious. Okay? Let it be gracious, seasoned with salt. What that means is understand what you're saying and say it correctly. Don't be a jerk. Okay? Don't come down on people. Don't talk like you're above people. Okay? You're not going to appeal to anyone if you come across as being better than them. You're no better than them. You may be in a better condition spiritually, but you're certainly no better than they are in terms of a human. 2 Timothy 2, verses 24 through 26. The Lord's servant is what? To not be what? Not be quarrelsome. Okay? Don't quarrel with people. They want to say something, let them say it. And then if they're going off in some tangent they don't need to go, steer them back to the right direction. Okay? You want to be focused on the message of Jesus when you talk and when you deal with other people. Okay? Be kind. 2 Timothy goes on to say, be kind and be gentle in your language, in the way that you approach and you talk to other people. Okay? So that's the first observation we make about Paul. And that's a great lesson to all of us. Okay? It's a great lesson to all of us. I'm sorry to say that when I was growing up in the, in the 50s and the 60s, late 40s in the church, that was not necessarily the attitude, unfortunately, that all Christians had in the church. And that was unfortunate because while they were the fastest growing religious group in the United States, that all came to a halt. And I think part of it was because of the tactics that they used. Okay, they no longer appeal to people. But that's for a for a different study. But certainly we get that great lesson here from this. Now, let's talk about Paul's purpose a little bit more. Notice that he states his purpose in the first verse. He says, "In my defense," this is what I have to say. So Paul's purpose was not to recount his conversion. He used his conversion to provide his defense. But his primary purpose was, in the context of what he said, in the context of what he had earlier said, it was to explain his actions, what he had done before he was converted, and then why he was converted, and why he's doing what he is now, what he's doing now. He was not witnessing in the strictest sense of the word about his conversion story, which of course is a very common thing for people to do today, to relate their conversion story. But there's some drawbacks to doing that I think we need to be aware of. And these are, partly my own opinion, but they are also backed up by other people that I know in the brotherhood. That the problem with using your conversion story to try to convert other people is their conversion is about what you told them, not about what Jesus is. And not all of us have the same conversion story. Okay? So it becomes, when you relate your conversion story to try to convert other people, that doesn't mean it can't be part of what you tell them. Okay? But the main thing to remember is that nowhere in the New Testament is witnessing a person's personal story a method of converting people in the New Testament. What's the message that you always need to use when you're trying to convert someone else? Why did you convert? Why did you convert? And by that I mean it's about Jesus. It's not about you. It's about Jesus. You tell the story of Jesus. Okay? You tell the story of Jesus. Tell them why they need what Jesus offers. Okay? And then, of course, if you happen to tell them, well, I came to that realization, and then I accepted Jesus. I was baptized for forgiving my sins. I became a Christian. You can include your story, but you don't want to be your conversion story as the primary focus, because conversion stories can be very subjective. Okay, a lot of us came to be converted, and we came out of a variety of circumstances. Okay, I know Jack and I and others were raised in the church, so we were converted as youngsters. David, we were all converted. Cindy, and I mean, there's a ton of us in here, right? We were converted primarily through the efforts of just growing up around our family, our parents, or parent, depending upon whether we were one parent or two parent homes. I myself was baptized at Yosemite Bible Camp. Okay? So others, and I know others in this audience, have come out of a situation where they had an addiction of some kind, where they were in circumstances where they were involved in some activity that they should not have been in activity other than that. I mean, it's just a number of things that we need to remember. That so what you're related to them in terms of your conversion is not necessarily relevant to them. Okay, and so we need to remember that. What is the gospel message? What's the gospel message? Jesus' birth, his crucifixion, and don't ever eliminate that. Don't ever eliminate that. The horrendous suffering that he went through, okay? His crucifixion, his death, his burial, and then what's most important, his resurrection. Because that's at the crown of why people need to be converted. Because just as Jesus was resurrected, he brings resurrection to those who establish a belief in him and are properly converted. So our approach to people should be, and should always be, when we are sharing, and that's why I don't completely agree with our book when it says about, that Paul was, when he was sharing, or that we need to share to be like Christ. Let's face it, while we live a life in trying to imitate Christ, none of us, I don't think any of us, like I know, will ever go through what Christ went through. Okay? So the best we can do is, from a personal standpoint, is understanding and trying to get others to understand why they need Jesus in their life. And then if you want to add, this is why I needed Jesus in my life, you can add that to it. But your primary focus should always be about Jesus and about his death, his burial, and his resurrection. And that's what they should be converted to, not to some other story that can be told in a very subjective way. Okay? That make sense? I don't think I did it. I don't think I did an injustice to chapter 22, but I think in fact, when I was doing this study, a light came on, and they come on once in a while anyway. It struck me that Paul wasn't using his conversion story to convert anybody. He was not going to convert the group he was with. And verse 1 reveals what he was really talking about. And it's very easy for us to sometimes, when we go through Scripture, to read it and to not really absorb what's really there, what's profound. And what's profound there is Paul is defending himself. He's not trying to convert somebody. And he's also telling folks why he knows he needs to leave Jerusalem, and why, and in fulfilling the commission that God entrusted to him. A good friend of mine, who was a preacher, now retired, made this statement, and I'm not saying it exactly like he did, but I think it rings home. When you are trying to convert somebody, he said, to paraphrase him, before you tell people what they have to do to be saved, tell them what Jesus has done for them. Tell them about his suffering, about his crucifixion, about his death. Tell them what Jesus has done for them before you ask them what they need to do to be saved. Because you will lead them to the point of understanding what they do need to be saved. So sharing, yes. Sharing as individuals, sharing as a church is always what we need to do. And we need to be a sharing church. But we need to understand, I think, what the reason for our sharing is and what it is we're to share. Trying to convert someone is always about Jesus. It's never about me or you or somebody else. It's about helping people to understand why they need Jesus, but first tell them what Jesus has done for them. Help them to understand that. Any final questions, comments, thoughts? Disagreements? Yes. Okay, now be careful. No, I'm just kidding. Right. That's true. That is absolutely true. When you are sharing with a large group, you never know. But it's the power of the gospel that works in their lives, not what you did. And that's the main thing to remember. Yes, John. Hopefully. Mhm. Sure. And that's what lies within our hope and our faith in the resurrection. Because we know at some point we're going to be able to be with the Lord, just like those who walked in the first century. Now, he may not be in that same form, but we'll certainly be able to recognize him. I mean, he's going to be, he's sitting on the throne, okay? And so that obviously is what the hope that lies within us is that there will come a time when the Lord chooses, whatever that is. Either we leave the earth before he comes back, or he comes back at the time we're still walking the earth. That we will also be in the personal presence of the Lord. Any other thoughts? Thank you very much. Lesson 12, no, lesson 11, I'm sorry. Lesson 11 next week, and Brian will be with you for the next couple of weeks.